working. But it says, let's work. Right, transcription and recording is on. There's a share invite, by the way. All right, so first of all, I want to introduce myself. It allows me to go to the next slide. My name is Kevin Plumbing. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Department of Systems Engineering. I'm also a UW-Madison PhD candidate, the journalism school there, and I'm a former public affairs specialist for the U.S. Army. I'm also a CSU alum. Got my master's here and my undergrads. So what do I do for my job? So a lot of people maybe sometimes are curious about this. When we have faculty candidates, a lot of times I ask them what communications could do for them. And a lot of times they say, well, they can promote my research. I'm like, yeah, I can do that, but I do a lot more than that. I think about my job as three main categories, which is public relations, internal communications. Thankfully, we have people like that who also help with internal communications, and marketing, which is what Tom Bradley hired me to do. But regardless, it all kind of falls within the whole umbrella of communications. But what is my actual job? Like, if I were to summarize the whole thing, I would say that my actual job is a little bit different than just doing those three forms of communication. My actual job is to promote or to protect. Sorry, I say that first. People forget. To protect and promote your credibility, right? Or by your and ours. First of all, it's my credibility, but the organizational credibility. Why credibility? Because that is how your organization and yourself, that is how you're valued in the courts of public opinion, public affairs, right? If you have less credibility, you have less value. More credibility, greater value. You can lose all your credibility at once and have to work to get it back. But what is credibility? Right? Let's get into that a little bit. There are two types of credibility that I like to break it down into. There's grounded credibility, and I'm going to try to pronounce the word plebiscitary credibility. Plebiscitary. It goes back to kind of like think about that as the ancient people talking about the different voting blocks, right? Groups of voters. Right? Think about. Actually, I'll get into it a little bit more. I have here a article from the Pew Research Center talking about differences between journalists and the rest of the public when it comes to whether or not they should say, both sides of the story, right? Should I tell both sides of the story? Most of the public says, yeah, you should tell both sides of the story. Journalists are like, A lot of times, maybe not both sides. Sometimes there's one side that's not as credible as the other, right? And this will maybe get into why that is. Grounded credibility. You might ask, what is the source, and are they in a position to know this information? Is the content verifiable and properly contextualized, right? Have the sources done the work to understand something? It is hard to understand things, right? Have they done the work? Grounded credibility is, were you there and did you understand, right? That's a lot of times in academics, that's what we think is the most important kind of credibility, right? We think the facts speak for themselves, but they don't always speak for themselves. They can, but they don't always. So if it does actually matter, that we care about the other kind of credibility. Facilitation, right? A lot of times we think of this as ideological. Does it align properly with our political tilt? No, and we think, oh no, we're apolitical, we're wrong. Everybody's a little political, right? Even if it's not like the standard politics that you might think of as like the two-party system. We all have a position in which we have a stake. And so we have to defend it, right? Does your position speak to a particular ethics, right? That will tell you whether or not you're part of a participatory group. This is what people mean when they say, know your audience. I don't really like that as much because these days it's really, really hard to know your audience, especially with like AI mediated algorithms that put information in front of people's face. A lot of times people don't even know that they're part of your audience until all of a sudden the video shows up in their face, right? So the difference is you need to know how to read the room. So you need to be up to date on what people are talking about, what kinds of positions they're taking on issues, what's relevant to your organization, all of that kind of thing. That's another form of credibility. If you have a lot of really grounded facts, but you're not taking the right position to the audience that you're speaking to or to the stakeholders that you need to have on your side, that you need to rally to your position, then you're in trouble, right? Okay, so asset number one, I have 3 lessons, right? But I hope you guys take away from this. I've explained to you what my job is. Now I'm going to tell you about how you can leverage assets like me. And how you can become your own asset. And that's lesson number 1, right? Lesson number 1 is ask for help to get better at communicating with yourself. One of the main things that you can do to start with is understand the difference between message and information. That goes back to what I was talking about, right? A message is what we care about, what we think is important. That's always a little bit ideological. Information are verifiable facts. This is what that looks like. This is, let me introduce you, the first message theme in the 2 main messages. We have more of these, but for the department, and that shouldn't be any surprise to you, right? We provide quality education to manage a complex world. Whenever I'm writing an article or I'm creating a product, I look at that and I say, how can I make sure that this message comes across from this product that I'm putting together, right? We address the most important socio-technical systems problems of our time. We hold ourselves to the highest standards of integrity, rigor, and quality. All right, so if you really think about it though, I didn't really say anything, right? Other than these are things that we aspire to, these are things that we believe in, this is what we think is important. When things really start getting meaty, when things are really impactful, it's because the message is paired with a fact. A message is paired with proof points, we often say, or information, right? And so I reduced the size of the message for a reason, because a lot of the times information matters the most. Because they do kind of speak for themselves a bit, right? Like each fact or information speaks to generations upon generations of people who forged that fact, who argued for that fact, who worked hard to establish it as truth. So here we have some facts, right? These are pretty top level facts, right? But as you can read, all of these things are things that I can prove, right? I can show you the articles that we publish in these areas, transportation, energy. I can show you that we hire professors who are published, that we engage in peer review. I can prove those things. The messaging isn't necessarily provable in the same kind of way, if that makes sense. Or rather, the information proves the message. Okay. Something that you can do to become a better communicator is to think like that. Have you presented information and messaged it? A lot of times researchers just present information, they don't message it. Sometimes if you're just messaging, people just tone you out. You just sound like you're marketing something, right? Because marketers do way too much messaging. And that's a critique to marketers, although I think most good marketers understand this, right? That information matters. But I can help you create a guide. Say there's an event, a journalist reaches out to you, and you want to know how to communicate well with this journalist. Or say you have a really important meeting with your boss, or you are doing a presentation to a room full of people, right? We can describe the background. We can state and instate, and it's always ambitious, right? Like this one, for example, says establish CSUSC as the go-to authority on providing clear clarity to infrastructural cybersecurity risks, et cetera, right? That's not a low ambition. That's a high ambition, right? And this is something that I helped Dr. Daly do when he had a media engagement, right? Which was successful. It was one of the slides that I put up, or a picture that had an earlier slide. But see, we have a message, and then each talking point is information, right? Very helpful to do this. Also, at the end of this, I'll tell you what are your left and right limitations. Do not talk about this because that is not our area that we can talk about, right? That's outside of our scope, outside of our lane. That's not what we can speak to, right? We can't speak for the company that was in trouble here. The journalist doesn't want us to try. The journalist wants us to speak to ourselves, what we can speak to, right? Stay in your lane. Something that helps us a lot in helping you become a better communicator is give us information. The number of times that I have been told, hey, write an article about something, and there's like a 3-word, description of what I need to write. And then someone forwards me a huge list of just back and forth emails of them talking to somebody I don't know, right? Like that requires me to do some archival work, right? That's a lot of work to try to figure out, and somebody could have just called me and explained what was going on, right? Information is important. I'm driven by information. I'm going to message nothing unless I have information. If you want to leverage your communication assets, give me the facts, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Then I can give you advice on what you want to do. Maybe it's not an article. Maybe you want to do a social media post. Maybe you want to do a podcast. Maybe you want to get on Saturday Night Live. Just kidding. I can't do that for you. All right. So we just explained how you can leverage communication assets by becoming a communication asset yourself. That's one way that you can incorporate me into your work. Create guides until you're so good at it, you don't even need it, right? Obviously, keep me in the loop regardless, because I probably pay attention to news more than most. Maybe not some of our bosses. Their bosses are constantly on the news. They get up real early. But for people who are within your organization, when you're junior, odds are good. I have a broader understanding of what's happening within the general discourse. So, number 2, how to leverage communication assets is know your communicators. Get to know them really, really well. Almost every organization has at least one, hopefully, right? You have to communicate. There's no way around it. You must communicate for a few reasons. First, say there's a crisis that happens, right? And a crisis is something that threatens the identity of your organization or your personal credibility to the point where it could be completely ruined, right? When a crisis happens and you're involved, there's a void of uncertainty that opens up, right? There's that moment where nobody really knows the truth, or everyone's a little afraid. If you don't communicate and establish yourself as the go-to place for information, somebody else will. And they're not going to be as good at it or as accurate as you are. You have to establish yourself in that moment as the communicator if you want to have a fighting chance of directing the narrative. A lot of lawyers don't necessarily like that because they think that nothing's real until it's in a courtroom, right? But a lot of lawyers also know better, right? If you have a competent communicator on your team, then you want to be able to communicate in that moment. Another thing is you have to tell your story because nobody else is going to do it unless you do it first, right? You can always get someone else to help you tell your story later on, but not unless you already told your story. That is, you need to know your message. You need to know your position on issues. You need to understand what facts matter to you, right? You need to understand what your ambitions are. What is your goal? What is your strategy? All of that stuff in order to tell your story. Okay, lastly, you're going to need Aaron, you sorry about that. Lastly, you need to defend your credibility, right? Say somebody goes out and they argue that you aren't as good a researcher as you said you were, right? Well, you need to be able to speak to that. You need to be able to say, well, maybe I made some errors here and there, but for the bulk of my research, I've, done very well, blah, 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 right? You need to be able to defend your credibility. So you can't just go in there and be like, oh, no, I'm scared I'm not going to say anything. You have to be able to assert yourself. How many times have I been in situations where, I'm dealing with secret information in the military or whatever, and everyone's like, oh, don't talk about this or don't talk about that. That's classified. And I'm like, well, what do we need to do to unclassify? Because sometimes it doesn't make sense to just be quiet, right? Because others will speak for you, and you don't want that to be your enemy. You know what I mean? Thankfully, the military is pretty good at this. They have the Defense Information School. They've learned a lot of things. I went to the Defense Information School, worked alongside enlisted and officers to learn how to be a good communicator for the Department of Defense and for the U.S. government. Very high quality education. But communications can be really risky, right? You need to know who your battle buddies are. You need to know how to do this smart. Also, getting to know your communicator. This is a list of, and it's not a complete list, but it's a very extensive list of all the different skills that a communicator can bring to the table, should bring to the table, right? That's a very diverse and very long list. You could be a professional in this field if you're an expert in one of those, right? If you're getting good at any of these or any set of these, then you're already getting up that ladder, right? Again, there's a reason why communicators get paid very little or an awful lot, right? You can also get good at these skills too, right? So it's important to keep in mind that when you are getting to know your community, that there are limits to their knowledge, and you should find ways to leverage their strengths. Listen, if you're like, hey, I want to be in a podcast, but your communicator has no experience with facilitating a podcast, but maybe that's not the strategy you use. You know what I mean? Or you find who else you can talk to help facilitate that happening. Maybe you both get experience. But a good communicator is going to understand your limits too. I'm not going to put you in front of a camera for CNN if you're uncomfortable talking to a camera, right? I'm not going to make you be the author of a publicly releasable article if you are uncomfortable with talking about your research in the public space. I can help you, but I'm not going to make you do it, right? All right. This one's really important for academics and science meetings. Do not underestimate our ability to understand and use the information you have. How many times have I been in meetings where communicators like, oh, well, you guys are so much smarter than me. You guys have to talk to me like dumb, whatever. They're doing that because they understand that is an expected response from somebody who isn't an expert in that field, right? They're doing it to facilitate that conversation. There's no reason why they can't understand what you're researching to the point that's where it's necessary to communicate with the audience. That is, a lot of times we don't have to get into the greatest details in order for the audience we're trying to communicate to mobilize in your favor. That makes sense? A lot of times the article doesn't call for us to have to cite 10 sources. And we can help advise them. But don't underestimate us, right? And I say this to the communicators too. Too often do I hear them say that they're not smart enough or whatever. That's ridiculous. We're all in this together to work on facilitating the value of our organization. So it's a risk benefit. Are there questions about that? Because I have another one.
I have a question. It actually goes back to your like defense or defending your research. How do you advise faculty to talk about the research and defend it without getting too defensive in the moment if they're talking to media?
We can get to that.
Okay.
If that's okay.
That's fine.
That's about managing expectations. Right. Sometimes the communication that we're giving out isn't what the audience needs. So the key is to defend your research is not to in a defensive way, but to think about how can my research actually be helpful to these people? And if it's not, just be like, look, your criticism is maybe valid for you, but it's not that useful to you. And they're gonna be like, I do it. And you're like, okay, it's gonna be useful to somebody. Anyway. The last thing to go ahead.
I was actually on the third point as well, defending credibility and speaking as a student with inexperience. What format does that usually look like? Because like I've seen in the literature where you see like nice comments page attached to an article where it has a back and forth a little bit on the credibility of the research and work done and published. Is that the format it usually looks like, or?
It could be in any number of formats. Yeah, it really depends on what kind of leverage the people who are criticizing you have. If the head of the CDC is criticizing you, it's like a crisis moment, right? We really need to know how to manage that. If it's somebody who has no power or influence over anything and it's just a comment section, sometimes you ask, is it worth putting myself on the line to reply to this? A lot of times it is, what is the proper way to reply? A lot of times that's, recognize the way that somebody's interpreting a thing, reply as wisely as you can in those circumstances. That means reply with the information that you have, given that you don't actually fully understand the criticism. Right. So that's something that we could discuss. Right. There's no hard and fast format. There's no hard and fast rule. Sometimes it's comment section. Sometimes it's an email. Sometimes it's political actions happening behind the scenes. Right. So defend your credibility. It really starts with when you're telling your story. If you tell your story up front really well constantly, then you have a track record that you can go back on. Information that you can put out. That makes sense. Move on to number 3. No more questions. Okay, number 3. Professional development. I'm going pretty quick, by the way, just saying. Not just you. This is professional development. Take care of your communicators. Right. So we talked about how you can become a better asset. We talked about how you can leverage your asset. Now we're talking about how to make your assets better. This is a really hard job, especially if you know what you're doing. Often we're the only communicator in the organization. Because of that, for our professional development, we really need to have leadership help us develop, especially if it's not in the field, like the communications field. It used to be that I could have a peer, one of my good peers or somebody who's a little bit more senior to me. They'd take me out to lunch and explain things, right? But now, the only people who can really explain things are people who are at the level of communicating that I need to be at. And usually that's senior leadership. And it can be strange for a senior leader to be mentoring somebody who's not a senior leader or is not aspiring to be a senior leader. But if a senior leader wants a communicator who's going to be of value to them, they need to mentor the communicator. They need to understand the issues at that level. That way, when that communicator goes down to help facilitate the rest of the organization in the way they communicate, we maximize our effort. Because when the lowest person in the organization, lowest as in like least responsibility, is able to talk like the highest person in the organization, then that gives us tons of credibility because everyone's on the same page. That makes sense, right? And I love doing that. I love telling the stories of like students that are just starting out doing cool things, talking like they're professors, giving us real information, right? Because that shows that we're giving them the opportunity to learn in a way that isn't, just a teacher-student, right? We're making teachers here. All right, so not an easy job. You need to have leadership, mentor your communicators. Also, you need to be able to, not just get to know your communicator, right? But also help them understand different things that they might not understand. There's stuff that you all know, I'm just not going to know. Right? Things that you take for granted that I just can't take for granted because I don't know about it yet. Part of getting to know each other, right? But some overlap maybe in these skills. Value is cultivated. You can definitely fill communications jobs for low pay. Right? There's tons of people out there who think, oh, I'm good at social media, I can do this job. Right? Because they are good at one of the skills that I showed you earlier. It is really easy to put a body into space in communications. That's definitely not the way you should think about it, right? You should think about it as how am I going to get the right people to grow them into the kind of communicator that I need them to be. So if you're going to have an entry-level position pay, then expect entry-level person to show up. They're going to know some skills, usually they're pretty well educated, but they need to know the institutional knowledge, and it's going to take a long time to bring them up to the level where they're making a much better salary, right? But then if you mentor them and you bring them up and they become good communicators and they understand institutional review and all of that stuff, institutional policies and practices, and they become more and more of an expert in the small area of operations they work in, they're going to move. They're going to go somewhere else. The turnover rates are really, really high in the communications field, right? Because there's some organizations that understand, and some organizations are like, oh, well, we're just going to do the whole market, right? Like, we can get somebody to do this job at the low pay, so we're just going to keep hiring low pay people. Then you never actually get the value that you invest in. Everyone wants a piece of the communications person. Even if you are a faculty member who has just one little task. Think about that, right? Every faculty adds up. It can take me an hour to do one faculty member's task. If every single faculty member had just one small hour-long task for me, that's 2 full days of work, right? Of constantly working and not doing all the other things that I need to be doing, scanning the environment, searching for people mentioning us on Reddit, stuff like that, right? Just tasks, just little things. I have to prioritize. Help me prioritize and don't get offended if I have to say, hey, that's lower priority right now. Our faculty is great at this. Thankfully, our department's pretty small in terms of faculty. Like, we have lots of associated faculty, and that's awesome. That's someone else's area of operation, right? When I go to someone else's area of operation, I send them a handshake and say, hey, I'm going to be in your area. I'm just letting you know that these are the people I'm talking to. And they're usually like, oh, great, awesome, share it when you can tag them, right? And sometimes though, they're like, oh, I want to be more involved with this. There's some issues going on, stuff like that, right? But thankfully, we don't have a lot of issues in our department with people overloading me. But I know other departments are much bigger than mine, and yet still one communicator. We're Taryn. Okay, Taryn's in the department in the mechanical engineering, and she has a lot to do. She has to prioritize things. All right, so before I get to concluding the talk, are there questions about point number 3? And feel free to put a question in the comment for anybody on the phone. Okay, so I'm a bit of a philosopher. People who know and talk to me know that sometimes I'll bring up like all, Descartes and stuff in plain conversation. Everyone's off. Oh my gosh, philosophy again. But this is really important to understand when it comes to science. And I'm talking to systems engineers, which is its own kind of philosophy. If you don't agree with that, then you should maybe learn the history of systems engineering a bit, right? Take Tom Bradley's class, right? He's always working on people to make them understand that this is a philosophical work. And I mean that in a very practical kind of way, right? Too often we have philosophers who are unapplied. I'm talking about the applied philosophers, right? Science and engineering are far more than what happens in your research, in your laboratory, right? In order for you to do your work, whole civilizations have to be mobilized to make it possible. That means funders, governments, political actors, supply chains, construction people, communicators, other engineers, whole histories of engineers, right? Make what you work with possible. There are people here doing amazing cutting edge things that have no idea how their computer works, right? If it weren't for the people who constructed that, who learned how to do it, who fought through the controversies to make it possible, right? Who put themselves on the line and got criticized and had their credibility questioned, right? It's hard work. Knowledge is made, forged, built with the blood of our work, through controversies and into uncertainty, right? That's what researchers are doing. They're trying to extend knowledge into uncertainty, the unknown. And there's going to be monsters in the deep. You're going to find things you didn't expect to find. That adds to the politics, doesn't supersede it, right? Doesn't just say, oh, well, no, this is a fact, so politics don't matter. It's no, it's a fact, and so now politics are interested, right? So let me talk to you about Bruno Latour real quick. It's a philosophy of science guy that I care about a lot. It's a great quote. Be not the one who debunks, but the one who assembles. Not the one who lifts the rugs from under the feet of the naive believers, but the one who offers arenas in which to gather. We assemble pathways through complexity. That's our main website. If you guys want to go. Also, anybody who's not currently a CSU systems engineering student, please visit our website. And I made sure to leave lots of time for discussion because I would like, because I know there's a few communicators here and a few communicators online. I would like communicators to maybe put in what are some of your pet peeves with working with academic engineers. Don't make it too personal, but like if you could put in a little bit of your pet peeves, things that can help systems engineers understand how to leverage our assets better. You can put it in the chat or I'm happy to discuss. And then also I'm willing to ask questions. What are your pet peeves and communicators? Yeah.
I guess I will start by speaking from a communicator standpoint. I think my pet peeve is being seen as the person who handles all the grunt work and not on the same professional level as somebody with a degree in science engineering. Communicators, like you said, have a ton of skills and are really valuable if you can rely and help build up their assets. So being treated as maybe less than is probably a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, getting those menial tasks that, would be. I personally, I don't always say no to those, right? I usually I try to say yes to those, because I'm trying to create a relationship. But if it starts becoming a problem where it's like, oh, hey, I need a flyer for this, tiny event, and it takes me, a day to create, and then it gets printed. And they're like, oh, no, we didn't like that, we're just gonna go with whatever graphic flyer we already had. Yeah, I may not work with you again, right? That lowers your credibility. No, it's true, that lowers your credibility with me, right? Because I have certain goals, I have certain things that I need to report back to my boss with and be like, hey, these were successes, these were not. We're gonna focus on successes, and working with so-and-so, not a success. Maybe we won't do that again until there's like a real reason to do so, right? Because I have to prioritize, so. Help us help you. Using overly technical language in non-academic publications is not reaching the target audience for social media and departmental promotion. Trust us when we use more familiar or fun language. That's good, right? Sometimes, depending on the goal of the communication, right? A lot of times we're like, oh, well, we have to break it down to the lay audience. That's not actually what we're doing, right? We're not actually trying to communicate your research to people who are dumb or naive. What we are doing is we're trying to take your research and assemble it in a way that allows them to join us in the arena. Does that make sense? It doesn't always require them to understand everything about the arena that you're in. Right? We're trying to get them to reflect to us, not to just over. Right? So if an article or a publication or something like that doesn't call for a certain level of detail, trust us when we tell you that it doesn't call. It's okay to correct us though, because we are still not necessarily experts in your area, right? We got to respect the subject matter experts as communicators, super important. And I'm always willing to help out for any communicators in our department. Or not department, in our college. I'm happy to help our communicators get that stuff because I have lots of experience doing that. Sorry, I had a notification that I could not evade. More questions?
Okay, so, how much information is too much information so that we're not just sending, like when I want to forward stuff on to you or Emily or Jenna, I want to send useful emails that aren't just taking up space in your inbox. I also don't want to send like 500-word email that's going to be a pain to get through. So what's a good balance, especially recognizing the large workloads?
Yeah, great question. I'm never opposed to more information from somebody who's within my area of operation. If you're within my area of operation, I'm already going to read. Okay, that is, if you're one of our students or you're one of our faculty members or something like that. Otherwise, if you're trying to get me interested in something, you got to pitch it to me, like you would pitch a journalist. It means most important information at the top: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Right. But I like information. So if you send me a long email, I'll read it all. It helps to bold the most important parts. I try to do that for emails I send to you all. And just so you know, for internal communications, when I send you an email, I always say opportunities. I list 3 opportunities. Each opportunity has to have the potential to change your life, or I won't email you. Those emails are worth looking at. Maybe it's not relevant to you, but each one has the potential to change your life. Usually it's like events and opportunities that you can take advantage of. Right, because I'm also sensitive to that. How much information is too much information? Sometimes the biggest issue is this the right time to communicate? Is the issue right? Right? Oftentimes we have professors who get a grant. We want a communication, and I'm all for that. I love doing that because it helps rally the actors that are necessary to make the funding actually do what it's supposed to. No. But often the real story is later, when they've done the thing that the grant told them to do, and they have results. The time to tell the story of results is not in the middle. It's when you have results. So it's good to think about when your information is right and lead with that. What is the stuff that you can communicate about now that will actually help people? And that's an important thing too. If your information isn't helpful to people, I might not be as interested. It can be entertainment value. It can be a time and place where they can go to get involved. It can be links to more information, all sorts of stuff, right? But think about what is the utility of this? That really gets going. Did I answer your question?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because,
So
and what if you don't know if the time's right?
it's always good to consult. Yeah. And honestly, if it's a huge email and you don't want to put the effort into it, call them. Right? Send me a Teams message and set up a meeting and we can chat about it. And I can give you information. Like our faculty is great at doing that. A lot of times there's, people get the email fatigue.
You can always use AI to shorten it too, like just like quick summary. Hey, is this something you're interested in? That actually is.
Yeah, AI. Some people, when I ask about what should I talk about, because I could literally talk for an hour about any one of these skills, right? But AI, if you look in here somewhere, I think AI and SEO knowledge, right? Like search engine optimization. That's really it's a good starting point for a lot of things because at the very least it'll restructure your language into something that grammatically should make more sense to people. Although it doesn't always. Never trust the AI too much. I'm sure you guys have run into that in classes. Oh, we have a comment from Terry. The answer is not always a source story or a flyer, right? It's not always a source story or a flyer. Trust us when the athlete's methods, we decide tell a story. Yeah. Trust us when we have advice for you on how to communicate something or whether or not something is a good time to communicate. I'll give you an example, right? We're trying to have great relationships within COSI as in COSI becomes better and better at, being that professional development place for systems engineers, right? It's still pretty new. It's still in a lot of growing stages. And we want to help facilitate that. So they just created a new a PDP site, right? A new professional development program site. And, they've got a whole bunch of resources in there, but it's not super well organized. So what am I doing as a communicator? Helping them create a guide, right? Like a syllabus for a professional who's not enrolled in our organization to be able to read and get something from some academic work that's useful for them, right? Is that communications? Right? Is that a journalism thing? No, that's an educational resource, but it is communications because it's branded. It shows people where they can get education if they so chose, and it's actually useful. It gives COSI more structure, gives them more credibility, and as a partner of ours, that uplifts us as well. So free ourselves from the understanding that communication is just one thing. Liberate ourselves from thinking that. Like I promise you, there are things that I can help you with for just a course presentation, right? Just being able to talk about your science to your peers. Right? I'm not saying I'm good, right? Because I have to prioritize, but I could. Oh yeah. I've been working with Jim Adams on that PDP thing, and it's really, I think, impacted the way that they were thinking about how they were going to set up the user interface for their PDP, or maybe not the interface, but the experience itself. So that's to come. So keep an eye out for it. It's very interesting and useful, and maybe your friends who aren't in the program could get out of those things when we finally get them released. But obviously made in partnership with experts, right? Because I just did the formatting and professors do the articles and come up with the lessons for each. That's a bit of a tangent. Any other questions? We could talk about ability more. I could go back quickly, or we just stay on that topic all the time. What are some things that, okay,
I was just gonna look to give you a shout out for the way that your communications really let the faculty and student voices through. Because I had like actually sent prospective students or applicants, like pieces from, I like included a reference to your article if they asked me a certain question. I had a student ask me, what would happen if I was deployed? And you had done a feature article on another student that had talked about how she was recording, I think it was even for Jim Adams' class, recording that had, air sirens going off in the background at the very end of it. So she was actively deployed at that time, and I was able to directly cite that. So, letting your own voice or your student's voice come through, even when you're communicating perhaps about something technical, those can be really useful. We read those, we send those out too.
yeah, and in this case, I can demonstrate something. It's correcting the record. In the article, she talked about a time when she was in a master's program deployed doing that at a different university. However, it applies in this case as well, because she is still an outstanding airman of the Air Force. And she's enlisted, which is extremely rare. The enlisted person working on a PhD as it's always nice to be in these really technologically savvy rooms because it's just random things for me. And then all the systems engineers in here are like, oh, so I have to check the requirements. Okay, well, I don't want to hold anybody, and we can end this a little bit sooner unless people have a question or comments. Right? We live in a very fraught and difficult communications environment. Right? We've made decisions in systems engineering to present ourselves in a very particular kind of way. If you notice, I don't share as much like fun undergrad kind of content. Obviously, for the graduate students, but we could. You guys want me to do some videos, do some more reels? Fortunately, we don't do TikTok because we want to minimize the number of cybersecurity issues we may have, which is true of all social media. But if you got to pick a few, stick to those few, right? You have to communicate. If you're ever interested. Also, if you want to work with me directly, if you have like a fear of communicating, I can help. Thank you, Taryn. She just said I'm great and I deserve a raise. Thank you for everybody online. We apologize for any technical difficulties, and if you're viewing this as a recording because I wasn't able to provide the right information to get online, I do apologize. That was error of the department. We will correct the next time.
Yeah, I will note, we have since learned how to schedule this room a little bit better. There were issues with having different teams invites with trying to schedule this room, and it wouldn't let me send out different teams invites, but I managed to find a certain way to set that up. So if anyone is ever trying to use one of these Teams enabled rooms and wants to send out multiple invites, but have everyone on the same Teams meeting, let me know, because there were big technical issues with that I finally troubleshooted myself and then sent a bunch of other people instructions on.
And sometimes you just have to manage the rage of somebody who's working with technology. I can help with that.
So it should be on
Volunteers.
future Friday talks.
Yeah.
I've got
Speaking of
the
which, what's the
technique
next
down.
Friday talk? Is
The
that-
next Friday talk is not until after spring break, and that is going to be Dr. Herbert will be covering some techniques in MATLAB for, I think, really useful for current students.
Nice. So put that on your agenda. All right, we're gonna go ahead and end it early, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.